so forth. So I'm not suggesting that we would do anything different than what was done.
I have a question.
Yes.
Maybe I missed something. I'm looking at the chart. Q is not one of the books in the canon, but some of the material in it, some important material, is in Luke and Matthew, according to this chart, and that's the Lord's Prayer and other things. So it was a source, but not part of the canon, right?
Yes, let's go back to that chart just a minute. We didn't.
Sorry, you probably covered it.
Yeah. This chart here, what this is intended to show is in the sort of purple is that that 76% of the book of Mark reappears in the books of Luke and Matthew. But when they're in the books of Luke and Matthew, they aren't 76% of Luke and Matthew. They're only 41 and 45% because they are larger books. Now, as far as Q, and that incidentally to scholars, that is known as the triple tradition, the tradition that these three books have this relationship. The double tradition is the tradition that there is a certain amount of material in Luke and Matthew that comes from another source other than Mark. And so that is what is called the double tradition, which you see down in the middle, and that's labeled Q. Q means that there's 23% of the book of Luke and 25% of the book of Matthew. They're almost the same size books, so it'd be about the same percentage. They come from a source that scholars have called Q. Now, here's to complicate it a little bit, there's another part of Luke that is unique to Luke. That's designated here by L. So that would be known as the L source. That's a source that Luke got material from that nobody really knows because it's not that in Matthew and it's not in Mark. The same thing in Matthew. There's a green area that says it's unique to Matthew. So 20% of the book of Matthew is unique to Matthew. So that's called the M source. So is that answer right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this double tradition Q is a source that we've talked about, which scholars have tried to recreate into this book here, but it's lost. It's never, and obviously not part of the canon. It's never been found. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask on the part. I was particularly curious about the part that's unique to Luke because it's a large part of Luke. I mean, is there no thought about where that comes from? Is there any theories about where it comes from?
I don't know, but I do know that it is referred to as just as the Q source is referred to as the L source. So it presumes that he had a source other than the sources that were available to both of us. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think that's a collection of parables.
For the
L is a collection of parables. Yeah.
Yes, Charles.
Paul was, when Paul wrote the books that he wrote, whichever
Right.
ones those were, was he using that codex technology that, I'm going to call it a technology, that you
In
were talking
letters?
about? Pardon?
In the letters?
Yes.
I don't know.
Okay. Do we know roughly what time frame those letters were written in?
We know with roughly a time frame when the letters were written because I have that on the first page.
Oh, okay.
You know, the earliest in the dating here, which is, I say, I'm careful to say is estimated date because, you know, a lot of this is just estimated. And these, who wrote these books of the Bible, we just have to say that we don't know who wrote these books of the Bible. You know, one of the things about the books of the Bible is they don't, I mean the canon I'm talking about now, they don't say, Jesus and I did this. You know, Jesus went with me and we went up. And so it doesn't give you that feel that this person really was that close to it. That might have been 50, 60 years later that they were writing this, you know. so we just don't know who wrote them. Early tradition has assigned some of these books to certain individuals, and they may be correct, but they may not. So it's just hard to say.
The rest, an extension of my question is, what is the nature of this codex, C-O-D-E-X?
Yes.
And what is the nature of that codex technology? And when did it come into being once again?
Well, the codex began to be used just about the time of the crucifixion of Christ. But it was 300 years after that until it was the predominant way of writing. There were still scrolls, and so that's why you may discover, if something was excavated and it was estimated to be from the year 200, it could be either in codices or it could be in scrolls, either one, because they were both in use at that time. But it took several hundred years for that to become the accepted way. Yes.
So the double tradition of Q, the parts that we understand, like the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord's Prayer,
Yeah.
etc., are fairly accessible. However, I've tried to read like the Gospel of Thomas, and parts of it are completely uncomprehendable to me.
Yeah.
And I've read, I don't know if this is a good scholarly article or not, but I've read that some of the book of Q was written from the perspective of not Jesus as the Christ, but Jesus as a teacher of the time.
Yes.
I don't know if you have
Yes.
anything to say
I
if
think
that's
you're
true or
going to
not.
read a little bit of that in this, that you're going to see that the very earliest sayings of Jesus and all are not like the book of John, for example, where he's already been made into this individual that sort of supersedes the basic teachings of a person that would be walking around the shores of Galilee trying to gather a few people around him to preach to them. You know, so not to, I mean, both are valid, but Q is going to take you back to that part of it more, you know. Interestingly, this discovery that these two men made of the gospel has really been one of the great, it's shed a lot of light on a lot of other things that had been questioned up to then. Any other comments or questions?
Well, is
Yeah.
there a reason you didn't correlate John with these also? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? No.
Yes, John is not considered a book that gains any source from these other three books, and that they are so, and they're called synoptic because they do all relate to each other and were used, according to most scholars, that Mark was the original source for this. You know, there's a minority view among scholars that maybe Mark was not the first. So what if Mark got the material that's in Matthew rather than Matthew getting it from Mark, that it was the other way around, that Matthew was first and that Mark got the material from him.
So why did the canon decide to have Matthew, Mark, Luke? Why did they go in that order?
Well, I don't know that the order is important. You know, there are still some Christian religions that don't subscribe to exactly the 27 books. That one or two are changed, that maybe left out. Revelation is a book that's always been sort of hanging in there, trying to protect its
out.
turf.
That's right.
So,
That's right, yeah.
any other question? Yes, Rob?
This is very believable to me as we harmonize between what is historical and what isn't, and how we process it. It's my understanding about 10% of the population in Jesus' time was literate.
Yeah.
So people would have to rely on their ability to remember what was said and to re-say it, but also that desire then to write it down. I don't think we're any different today than we were then, or vice versa, that we'd say, hey, did you hear what Bill said? Well, you know, I've taken some notes on it. How often do you leave church after hearing a sermon and you've written some note about what John Debevoise or Nicole or Kenny said, right? So that part certainly seems authentic to me.
Yeah.
That this is the case.
I always had a question. When Jesus was 12 and he preached and he read from the scrolls in the temple, and I thought, he's 12. He's the child of a carpenter. How can he read? And that was something that I don't think was ever clear to me, because it didn't seem like he would have been part of that 10% that could read, although maybe Jewish people were better educated than the rest of them. I don't know.
Well, you know, that to me, and it just makes me feel good that I can speak with a group like this, and we can talk about things like this without thinking that it affects the way we feel about what God did for us in Jesus Christ. And so when we get that message from the Gospels, we don't need to nitpick anything. We don't need to question this and that and the other, because most of us, our faith is experiential. It's what we feel in our heart is what makes a difference to us. If our faith depends on whether it was wise men or whether it was shepherds that came to the nativity, then it's fragile, you know?
That's right.
And so it's good to be able to talk about things like this, and they're interesting, but they're in a perspective. Yeah.
Just as an observation, relative to what the gracious lady up here just said, when Jesus was 12 years old and the son of a carpenter, obviously I have no knowledge of that. Daniel Boone was 14 when he left Boonesboro, Maryland, and went south for a year into First North Carolina on his exploration, and was gone for a year and came back and said, "Hey folks, I think we need to go south." And the key thing there being 14 years old, when I found that out, that is incredible. I think about being 14, I was lucky to go to town. And so I don't know what to do with that, but certainly 12 and 14 a long time ago is different from 12 and 14 today.
Yeah.
Yes, Rob.
Yeah, Paul, I just want to reinforce what you're saying about collection of sayings. One of the problems we have as Christians is we're confined to the Bible. We don't know about the writings in Latin of the Roman Republic and Empire. We don't know about the writings in Greek coming from Athens. We're just narrowly focused on the Bible. And one of the things that we discover, if we look at the writings in Latin, the writings in Greek, is this is very common. Some of Aristotle's entire books on ethics, what they are notes taken from his students. And they say that. These are notes taken from my students when I taught on ethics in Athens. And it's simply a collection of sayings. And again, we're not aware of that because we spend all our time focused only on Christian literature, rather than looking at what was dominant in the first century. The books in Latin and Greek were dominant, and their styles is what the Christians copied. And so what you're saying is absolutely true. And we're simply not aware of that non-Christian literature that's out there, but it proves what you're saying.
It's a context.
One thing I was
Yeah.
going to mention in answer to your question is about Thomas. There's an interesting theory that this Nag Hammadi discovery, there was a reason that somebody buried this jar with all these books in it, and the fact that that apparently it dated to sometime around 430. I said it was in Coptic, 430 CE. Well, you remember I said a while ago that the canon really didn't come into being as it is now until fully until about 397. So there's some theory that maybe some of the material in this jar, some of these codices would not be considered canonical. And so they was buried, it was some of it was even considered to be a little Gnostic. It was a little bit off the mainstream of what was considered Orthodox Christianity. That maybe that we should go bury this because now the man has said that these 27 books are it, and we're not supposed to add anything to them or take anything from them. And it might have been buried for possible unearthing at some later time. But that's there's no way of knowing that.
Somewhere I read that the bishop said to them, this stuff is heretical, get it out of the church. So they took it and hid it for posterity, but that it was a direct order that this was heretical stuff. Having read some of it and also read the description about it, I would suggest if you read it, and you ought to go find it if you're interested, be sure you get the commentary on what the Church of Thomas says they mean. Because some of them are pretty obtuse. Some of them you would see right exactly, go, oh yeah, that's right from the Bible. But some of them aren't. And it helps to know the commentary. A while back, a group of folks came to John and wanted to have a wedding here because their church wasn't big enough to accommodate this wedding. And they had been turned down by several folks around other denominations. And he said, and you are the, who are you now? He said, oh, we're the Church of Thomas. And these were Indian people, right? And
Wow, yeah.
so he said, the Church of Thomas, and the guy says to John, you know, Thomas? Right. Oh, yeah. So they've had 2 weddings in our sanctuary.
Wow, that is.
Well, you know, the Gospel of Thomas, it's you were pointing out, some of it is perfect, just things we always do unto others, you would have them do unto you, so forth. But then there are other things in there that says the Christian will take off his clothes and stand on them, or you know, just stuff
Very
that just
weird.
really you say, wait a minute, where did
Really
that come
strange.
from? Yeah, so that's what you're talking about. So that is the part that sort of gets out of the mainstream. Yes, Bill.
Paul, one other thing that may speak to this question about the 12-year-old being literate. A couple of things I've heard. First of all, not too far north of Nazareth was a major trade route. And some scholars believe that Jesus may have had a much more cosmopolitan influence than we realize. The other is the Jewish religion was male dominant, and perhaps teaching a young male to read and lead would have been more of a priority. Again, it's not.
But it's interesting.
Yeah, it's a good question. But I forget the name of that city that's not too far north of Nazareth that was
Capernaum?
it may have been, maybe you remember. Anyway, I'm sorry I don't know the name of it, but there is this major trade route that people from many nations were using, and so he could have been Cephalus or something like, yeah. He could have been exposed to a much bigger world than you would. If you've been to Nazareth, it's just a tiny little insignificant place, or you know, even today it looks that way.
While I have you all, next Sunday, I don't know if any of y'all will be interested, but I thought we might talk a little bit about gratitude. It'll be 3 days before Thanksgiving, and talk about maybe